Good afternoon, everybody. Goeiemiddag. Coming from the Free State, I'll say Dumelang or Weni. Thank you very much, Arnold, for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to present this teaching and learning seminar. Arnold asked me to focus on academic leadership, and so I'm presenting a number of thoughts that have developed over many years in higher education. But more specifically, I want to acknowledge the academic leadership focused interest group. And many of the members are here this afternoon, where we've been discussing many of these ideas since May 2016 when the FIG was established. I misused the time of the FIG last Friday to present a draft presentation, and I got very good critical comments from them that I could then address, hopefully, to improve the presentation. I'll hear what you say afterwards if it is an improvement. So thank you very much for being here, and yes, those of you, if I can do a little bit of an advertisement, those of you who haven't been to the Focus Interest Group, it's an informal group meeting about once a month, once every 6 weeks. And if you're interested in joining, please give Claudia or Nicoline your names, and they'll invite you to our next meeting. Right, so as Arnold said, I'm trying to bring quite a lot of things together in the presentation. I hope I will be able to do so in a logical manner so that you can try to follow my argument. And it is there's quite a long presentation to get through, so I might need to go quite quickly over some slides, but I tried to include as much information as possible. So, thinking about academic leadership, I think necessitates one to consider the context in which we work as academic leaders. And I see academic leaders or academic leadership as quite broadly. I feel that everybody at the university, in whatever capacity you are there as an academic or somebody working in professional support services, has a leadership role to play. So the context is important, and I think currently in South Africa we certainly experience that the context, particularly the higher education context, is impacting on what we do, how we do it, and how we think about our own work. So what I'll be trying to cover is I'm going to look at the big context of globalization, neoliberalism and new public management, and then the implications of those for higher education systems. And then I'll move down to the organizational level, where I'll look at organizational managerialism and the implications of that for academic work. Then I'll refer to a few studies that have been done on academics' responses to managerialism. And then I will present what I believe are three important notions for the academic leader in a managerialist context, which is preserving the collegium, promoting inclusivity through distributing leadership, and practicing an ethic of care. And then I probably end off with a kind of a corny idea of soulful academic leadership. Right. So first of all, then, globalization. We are living in an age of globalization. I don't want to spend too much time on the concept. There's a lot of different definitions of the concept. And Larry Elliott wrote in The Guardian in 2016 that it became the day the Berlin Wall went down. And we know that that was more or less at the same time when South Africa moved into becoming a democracy. So the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. Some definitions: a process by which national and regional economies, societies and cultures have become integrated, whereas previously globalization focused more particularly on the economic sphere. More recently it has actually involved all spheres of human life: culture, media, technology, politics, and even, of course, climate change. So the point that I'm trying to make is we are living in an era of globalization. We cannot escape from that. That is the context, the big global context in which we live and work. Now, from there, I want to jump to neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is a particular element of globalization. And it is constituted through the domestic and global economic relations. So neoliberalism is how globalization manages domestic and global economic relations. It has become the new common sense. So many people, if you talk to them about neoliberalism, they would actually negate its existence, because it is so much the way that we live and the way that we do things. So it is the common sense. We don't really necessarily think about it. Neoliberalism has replaced the logic of exchange with that of competition. So competition is a very important concept in neoliberalism, and it advances a new anthropology called the Homo economicus, if we want to use it. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but still, it says something about the way that neoliberalism sees us, individuals, mainly as enterprising and competitive entrepreneurs. And remember those words, enterprising and competitive entrepreneurs. What I found very interesting in an article by Monbiot in 2016, written in 2016, is that he said neoliberalism actually recast inequality as virtuous, because it's about competition, it's about entrepreneurism. So inequality is a reward for utility and a generator of wealth. So efforts to create a more equal society are both counterproductive and morally corrosive in the new liberal paradigm or ideology. And I think immediately when one reads that, as South Africans, we have a lot of difficulties in accepting that. So I think some red lights start flickering. So where does it come from? The term was coined as early as 1938 at a meeting in Paris, but these ideas began to enter the mainstream in the 1970s. And I must thank Debbie Blaine for alerting me to a very interesting YouTube video where Noam Chomsky talks about neoliberalism. I tried to embed it, but I was worried about the technology, and I was also afraid that it might take up too much time. But do yourself a favor and watch that. You can just Google Noam Chomsky on neoliberalism, because he explains it very clearly how it actually developed since the 1970s, and particularly after Reagan and Thatcher took power. And there's a lovely insert in that YouTube video where he shows Jimmy Carter, who said, we've deregulated the airlines, we've deregulated the public service, we've deregulated what. So it was about deregulation. For Margaret Thatcher particularly, it was about crushing the trade unions. There were massive tax cuts for the rich, privatization, outsourcing, competition in public services. And then through the global organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the Maastricht Treaty, and the World Trade Organization, new liberal policies were imposed on much of the world. So once again, it's not something that we can deny, it's not something that we can escape, it is part of the world in which we live. So what happens in this ideology at a more practical level, at a systems level? And at a systems level, new liberalism manifests as new public management. So when we start talking about the practical manifestation at a systems level, we want to focus more particularly on the higher education system. So what I'm trying to do in the next slide is to show you what the practical manifestations of new liberalism or their new public management are, and what the effects of those are on higher education. So first of all, it is about the introduction, as I said earlier, of competition market type mechanisms. So in the higher education system, it is certainly about the increasing importance of international rankings. And as you can see there, Stellenbosch participates in those rankings. So competition amongst institutions internationally to get higher on the rankings, because that is what the reputation that the public has, or your reputation and how the public sees you, where you are on the rankings. Secondly, it's about the commodifications of services. And it could also mean then that higher education becomes a commodity. And I think the Australians really got this right. And I found this extract from the official website of Universities Australia, like we have University South Africa, very interesting, where the chairperson or the chief executive of Universities Australia explains how much money international education generates for the country. International education remains Australia's third largest export, just behind iron ore and coal. So we are now in the same breath as iron ore and coal, higher education. And what I found really interesting is this last sentence. Australia is a destination of choice for international students, etc., etc. From great brains to great beaches, Australia has it all. So there you have it. So, higher education as a commodity. Focus on value for money and doing more with less, more efficiency. Now, immediately I must admit that all of these manifestations of new liberalism or new public management have good and bad sides to them. I'm not saying that efficiency is bad per se. We all need to work more efficiently. We all probably need some competition in our lives to be more efficient and effective. It is about the aberration of these principles that I think we need to be careful of. So, the decline in public funding for higher education is then an effect, not only in South Africa, but across the world. There's a decline in public funding for higher education. And here we can see the blue government funds for higher education, how it is slowly but surely declining. And the green, the private income or so-called third stream income, stays more or less the same. We must realize that there's many universities different from Stellenbosch University who really struggle to get any third stream income. So the effect is that student fees must grow. to make up the shortfall. And of course, we don't need to be reminded about fees must fall 2-3 years ago. It also means that there's an adoption of an entrepreneurial culture. Once again, entrepreneurism per se is not bad. In universities, it means that we are trying to grow the third, fourth, and fifth stream incomes of the institution. But Burton Clark, a very well-known higher educationist, already in the 1980s said, entrepreneurial activities are fine, but they must stay on the periphery of the institution, and they must be used to feed the heartland, the academic heartland of the institution. If it starts changing around and academics spend so much time on their entrepreneurial activities that they actually do not pay sufficient attention to their core activities, then it becomes a problem. Central regulation and control, more central regulation and control, particularly for from government. And this is an extract from the recently released draft National Plan for Post-Secondary, Post-School Education and Training. It comes from the section on governance, regulation and accountability, and it says there's a concern that the ministry and department have been too quick to intervene in individual institutions. But, on the other hand, a concern that some universities ignore national policy imperatives, etc., etc. So, accountability, regulation of universities from particularly then government. There's a shift of priorities from universalism to individualism. Margaret Thatcher famously said in the 1970s, there's nothing like, there's no society, there are only individuals. So it's about moving away from the common good to the private good, even for higher education. There's an emphasis on service quality, consumer orientation, and choice. So then we start talking about the student as a consumer of higher education with choices to make. And there's a growth of contractual relationships. In other words, there's a purchaser and a provider, and we provide services like contract research, where we are then hired by an external organization, company, to do research. And I think all sorts of ethical questions come up in that situation. Sorry, now, yeah, my links aren't working very well. Right. So what are the implications of neoliberalism then for academic work itself? We look more broadly now at the implications for the higher education system, but for academic work. It has the effect of deprofessionalization. So it deconstructs the space in which we exercise our professional autonomy, according to Olsen and Peters. There's also a shift from collegial governance to more bureaucratic structures or hierarchical models dictated on management specifications of job performance. The implementation of academic restructuring initiatives very often take place in response to market requirements or the state, and not necessarily on academic, for academic reasons, for good academic reasons. There's increasing specifications by management over workloads, the programs that we offer, the academic structures that we have. there's an erosion of the traditional conceptions of professional autonomy over work in terms of both our teaching and our research. And then Kenny points out that higher education is basically seen as serving the needs of society by supplying suitably trained graduates. But it is frowned upon by society if higher education plays its critical role and starts critiquing what's happening in government or in society or whatever. I think we've all heard or seen on social media particularly the reactions to the reports that Mark Schwelling and his co-authors brought out, etc. So the critique doesn't go down very well. Now, in today's the conversation, there was an article written by Sue McKenna from Rhodes University, and I know many of you saw it. I heard some of you had quite interesting discussions in your departments or faculties about it. And she said she identified 5 signs that universities are turning into corporations. She said new executive positions and salaries is one, that people are appointed, not elected, even academic appointments. The decisions and policies that are taken, the regulatory frameworks that we have to comply with, and then the quick fixes, instead of thinking carefully about what would be in the best interest of academia, looking at quick fixes. So please read the article in the conversation. I think there's quite a lot of interesting ideas that Sue raises there. So, are we then talking about the enterprise university or the corporate university? If we come down further then to what happens in our place of work and we start talking about managerialism, this is an interesting, I hope you can see it, comparison of the liberal mode of internal governance of universities versus the new liberal mode of internal governance. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I think this comparison by Olsen explains a lot. And this liberal mode has probably disappeared about 30, 40 years ago, and slowly but surely we have been moving into the new liberal or managerialist mode. And I think a lot of the characteristics identified here we can recognize in our own institutions. So, if we then say managerialism is an organizational manifestation of new liberal ideology, what does it mean? It's the adoption of a more business-like approach and private sector practices. So we have strategic planning, objective setting. That is from Stellenbosch University Institutional Intent and Strategy. What our strategic planning looks like, strategic goals, etc. There's also a greater separation of academic work and management activity, and more control, more regulation of academic work by managers, performance management. I don't know about you, but I think we all hate it. Even the poor managers have got to apply it. But it's taking time to actually explain what you are doing, whereas all the evidence is there doesn't seem to make sense. There's a perceived shift in authority from academics to managers. One of the sources say it's about managers always know best. So there's then a weakening of the professional status of academics. There's an ethos of enterprise. Once again, if we look at our own institution, this comes from Professor Klutter's report to Senate last Friday. And Stellenbosch is right up there with the most patents resulting from our research. There's also an emphasis on income generation, Also from Professor Kluter's report. Third stream income from contract research. Look at how it has grown over the past 5 years. There's more measurement and quantification of outputs, for example, through performance indicators. This comes from the website of our Research Development Division. So everything is very much quantified. And we are all playing this game. So I'm not saying that we are the poor academics and these are these order of managers that wat ons almal in 'n blik druk. That is not what's happening. We are all complicit. We are all playing this game of performativity, pushing for more and more outputs. So, could it lead then to the toxic university? John Smythe wrote recently this book called The Toxic University, Zombie Leadership, Academic Rock Stars and New Liberal Ideology. Quite controversial, but an interesting read. It is available as an e-book in our library. Thanks, Sari. So, how do academics then respond to this managerialist context? And I must say thank you, Runel, for asking that question this morning, so I could include these slides. I looked and I could find 3 studies done on specifically this topic. The one was done in 28, or published in 28, done in English universities by Colsacker. And her research shows that academics are reasonably comfortable working with managerialist regimes. And, as I said earlier, they are instrumental in sustaining them. Far from becoming disenchanted by the impact of managerialism upon their daily life, they appear on the whole to be making sense of and adapting to the changing environment. So I think that is important, because much of these developments happened incrementally and slowly. So it is like, you know, the crayfish being put in a pot and the water is becoming hotter and hotter. So we've become used to it. We've started to also play the game. Another study done in the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK by Tielken a little bit later in 2012, and she targeted 9 universities, 3 in every country, and her findings was that respondents showed a clear dislike of the growing administration, the increasing competition for research funding, the obligation to fill in time-consuming grant applications, and the heavier workload. Examples of frustration and stress are omnipresent. However, while this may have affected their commitment to the organization, the institution, their involvement with the content of their work is still clearly visible. So academics disengage from the institution that employs them, but they are still committed to being academics, to the actual work that they do of teaching and research and their community engagement. Particularly interesting was the way some respondents managed to cope with the obligations imposed upon them. They found ways to work around these stressful obligations and survived by maintaining their autonomy and academic freedom through demonstrating symbolic compliant or pragmatic behavior. So you simply start playing the game, because that is what you are being judged on. And then I found one South African study. It's quite an old one by Webster and Mswetsa, but very interesting results. And they differentiated the following responses from academics, more negative maybe than the international studies. They said academics experienced a reconfigured relationship with management, and so they felt that vis-a-vis management, they were now seen as employees rather than as colleagues by management. There was an increase in the intensity of the work. So there was a lot of change. The student population changed, which impacted on their teaching activities. There was more pressures to publish, which impacted on the research and research output. And there was a devolution of administrative functions. So all of this made the intensity of the work much, much worse. There was a loss of shared identity, a loss of a sense of community. So it was everybody for him or herself. And there was also feelings of powerlessness in the face of change, and an increase in emotional labor. I found that concept very interesting. I think it's Hinchman that coined that concept of emotional labor, where he talks about surface acting and deep acting. Surface acting is if you actually play the game and you act towards the outside world. Deep acting is if you play the game and you actually start believing it yourself. So those are ways in which academics respond in South Africa to a managerialist context. I must also say that the study found that there was a small group of innovators who saw this managerialist context as an opportunity and adapted to that and went for it. So they saw it more positively. So they conclude as follows. Academics face a demand overload. They become deeply pessimistic about their future. They try to exit. There's an avoidance mechanism, not a solution. And then there's that small group who've responded to these demands in innovative ways. The difficulty is ensuring that these activities strengthen what Clark refers to as the academic heartland. The challenge, in the words of Colin Bundy, a former Vice Chancellor of Wits, is to fuse managerial imperatives with academic priorities. And I think that is a very important sentence, to fuse managerial imperatives with academic priorities. So, are there ways of doing it? Well, maybe we should just first say that this can really lead to aberrant behavior. This was on the 11th of March in City Press, where the chief editor of the Journal of Public Administration, had received a bullet in an envelope by mail, and he ascribes that to the fact that academics' articles are being rejected. So he wrote this article about how academics respond to this pressure to publish outputs, the focus on outputs. And we know that the study that Johan Mouton and his colleagues did on predator journals identified something like 4,000 publications by South African authors in predator publications. So I think this leads to behavior which cannot contribute towards the building a strong academy. So what is the role of the academic leader in all of this? Well, Kenny believes that academic leaders are needed at all levels to restore some balance to the power structures in higher education and to facilitate the contribution of academics to effective policy and strategy. So maybe that is the first one. Academic leaders, all of you who are here, you can facilitate the contribution of academics to effective policy and strategy. Use the committees where you sit on. Use Senate. Use all the avenues available to you to play your role in terms of effective policy and strategy of the institution. Now I said I want to look at three things. The first one then is preserving the collegium. So it is about protecting the integrity of academic work. And Kenny, who wrote this article, visualizes this as a fifth scholarship, focusing explicitly on professional academic leadership. So it goes beyond this notion of service or collegiality. but it becomes an active role for academic leadership that to ensure that the decision-making process within their organizations accounts for issues of concern to all academics because they cut across institutional and disciplinary boundaries. I need to digress for a moment. I mentioned the academic leadership FIG, and in I think June, August last year, July, August, we asked Majulete Matume to come and talk to us. He was one of the student leaders in the Open Stellenbosch movement. And we had a very frank discussion. And the one thing that Majulete really emphasized was, he said, why is it in this institution that students are immediately held accountable if they transgress? But we as students don't see evidence that academics hold each other accountable or that academics hold management accountable. And I think that there's obviously also some misconceptions there, because students often don't have all the inside knowledge of what happens in academia. But that holding one another accountable as academics, I think, really stuck with me. So it is not about creating constraining commonalities or emphasizing the lowest common denominators, but it is our commitment to a shared community of purpose and agreement on our standards of excellence. So it is about strengthening academia through the collegium. It is the commitment and agreement to work together through disagreements, to keep on engaging one another. So it means recognizing our serious academic obligations to each other and to the participation in the academic life of the institution, working with colleagues to develop appropriate expectations. Expectations that each person attend to the work of others and judge that work by criteria used for one's own work. So collegiality requires intellectual reciprocity with colleagues. Runel always uses the example of we are all back in our rabbit holes. And very often we are like that because we are so focused on meeting the criteria. I must be able at the end of the year to, in my performance review, to demonstrate that I actually met all my objectives for the year. So I put on my blinkers and I don't look at what my colleagues are doing. I'm just focusing on getting my stuff done. But I think that harms the collegium. So intellectual reciprocity with colleagues. Secondly, it's about distributing leadership. And I've got a lot of slides here. I'm going to go through them very quickly. But it is a view of leadership that's less the property of an individual. So we are really moving away from the notion of the hero leader, the single person who must take us out of this trouble that we are in. And distributing leadership, stretching that leadership over multiple people, spread it throughout the organization. It's about not the agency and power of individuals, but structurally conjoint agency. And it's about more than adding actions, because the whole is more than the sum of the parts when we really practice distributed leadership. And so the scholars on distributed leadership identify 3 patterns of concerted action. You can collaborate spontaneously, or you can have role sharing, or you can have formal relationships. So all of those are possible ways in which we can actually implement distributed leadership. And it can happen top-down, when senior leaders distribute leadership functions, or it can be bottom-up and spontaneous, and it leads to a division of labor. But what's very importantly in this one, it takes account of the skills and attributes of community members and the requirements for leadership on specific aspects of the task. Now, as academics, we all believe we have particular knowledge, skills, competencies that we can contribute. And distributed leadership is about making the best use of people's knowledge, skills, competencies in a particular situation. Because it need not be only the one person who takes the lead. Anybody with the necessary knowledge, skills, competencies can do that. There's 3 distinctive elements. I'm not going to spend much time on that. Just the last one, it's leadership according to expertise. So it's about learning together, constructing meaning and knowledge collectively and collaboratively. It implies that leadership is socially constructed and culturally sensitive. It's not a leader-follower divide. And it's not about the leadership potential of just one person, but the leadership potential of every single person. That is what's important. We can be so much stronger if we acknowledge that leadership potential of every single person. And then lastly, quickly, practicing an ethic of care. So it's defined as moral reasoning that derives from a concern for others and a desire to maintain thoughtful mutual relationship with those affected by one's actions. As academic leaders, others are affected by our actions, not necessarily only colleagues, but also students, also more junior staff. So it's about maintaining thoughtful mutual relationships with those people. The concern of this approach is the responsibility of the individual to respond to another in the other's terms, acting out of care for the other person, in the other's terms, not in your own terms. So this is distinct from conceptions of morality as justice, in that it does not attempt to follow impartial rules or ensure equitable treatment. And I'm sure a lot of you would like to engage with me on this, because what about fairness? What about justice? But it focuses on responsiveness to another's needs. And very importantly, it includes caring for oneself in a nurturing way. Litka says the essence of caring becomes a focus on acceptance of the other, both in his or her current state and as one capable of growth, nurturing the development of the one cared for. And from Nicoline Herman's excellent PhD thesis, care is more than simply good intentions. It is deep and thoughtful knowledge of situations, and importantly, in combination with activities and attitudes. It's not just about caring, feeling, it's about doing something about that. So, where does that bring us then? If we preserve the collegium, if we distribute leadership, and if we practice an ethic of care, could we then maybe have soulful academic leadership? And as I said, that's a very corny term, but it comes actually from a new book, and Peter Klopper, thank you Peter, I saw you here, alerted me to that book by Frederick Laloux, Reinventing Organizations. I didn't use a lot from the book because it focuses on what you must do with your organization. I wanted to focus more on the individual. But I did find this extract by Forbes interesting, changing the leadership narrative. So soulful leadership takes the other fork. It shifts the leadership narrative from material prosperity for the privileged few to greater well-being and prosperity for all stakeholders. Now I hope that you can see why I started with globalization and new liberalism, because that is about the competition. It is about the material wealth of a few. And we must shift that narrative. We must change that narrative. The new narrative encourages leaders and leadership to steer away from a narrow descriptive focus on what leadership is. It's not the personality of leaders and quality of their managerial thinking, towards a broader, more macro focus on what leaders should stand for. A public platform for increasing the well-being and prosperity of the greater many in real terms and not just symbolically. So, the questions that I leave you with. If we are serious about the future of the university, can we afford not to preserve the collegium? If we are serious about inclusivity, can we afford not to practice distributed leadership? If we are serious and honest about promoting social justice, can we afford not to adopt an ethic of care? And lastly, is it possible to be soulful academic leaders? Thank you very much.